Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with us is our senior fellow, Alan Dowd. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, good to be here.
And with me in the studio is our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Larry. And today we're going to discuss Alan's latest article in September was on for the survival of civilization, discussing NATO's beginnings and its design to deter war and maintain a peace through strength. But we'll also touch on the Ukraine.
Good.
And Alan, since we have yesterday's, and I'm speaking from Tuesday,
October
2nd, Iran attacked Israel with over 180 rockets that were launched at them. And since your paper discusses a lot of alliances in NATO, I thought I'd bring that up in the fact that not one Israeli was killed in this rocket attack, one Palestinian that we understand. So they did quite a good job with their missile defense system.
Yes.
And the help of the Americans and the British.
Right. Though this attack was different than the April barrage. Most of the April missile attack by Iran were slow-moving kamikaze drones and slow-moving cruise missiles. And that's why literally an unbelievable 99% of those inbound hostiles were intercepted in April. This time, the Iranians used fast-moving ballistic missiles, much harder to intercept all of them. And you can see from the footage that we've seen the last 24 hours, there were several of them either got through or fragments of them in pieces. Shrapnel got through because it's just harder to hit that. That being said, this, whatever you want to call it, makeshift alliance or coalition, again, helped Israel. This time it sounds like the U.S., Britain, Jordan, and Israel all intercepted missiles in one stage or one place or another. Jordan confined its intercepts to Jordanian airspace. Jordan allowed the U.S. and Britain to come into Jordanian airspace as well, it sounds like. And then U.S. naval and air assets, and I suspect British air assets, and then Israeli air and aerospace assets probably did the rest of the shielding. A great example of what partners and allies can do together. Also a great example of what Israel and the free world are up against. You know, this Iran, Hezbollah, Houthi, Hamas, what I call Hydra, basically just pelting Israel from every side, and the United States helping to a degree. I think the Biden administration, we can get into this if you want. It's done some things very well. I think it could do more, but it does sound like when push came to shove, both in April and this time, the U.S. had Israel's back.
Yes. Thoughts, Larry?
Yes. My thoughts is, Alan, you mentioned that American planes were over Jordan also. They had permission from Jordan?
Yeah, according to I think it was the Times of Israel reported that this morning, and that also happened in April. So that's good coordination. Jordan, as you know, Larry, and I think a lot of our listeners know, is a very close partner, security partner with the United States. We have some bases there. I think a lot of people didn't know about that until some of those Iranian militia rocket attacks a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Okay. I must admit, Alan, I wasn't aware that the airplanes were actually involved in shooting down the missiles. I thought it was the Navy. I thought it was the Navy system. I didn't know the Air Force fighter planes.
Well, that certainly was the case in April. It could be that it could have been again, these all open source materials is the only thing I have access to, and it could be that I'm certain that the April attacks were intercepted by air and ground and naval. This time, I just know that the Jordanians opened their airspace, so perhaps there were ground-based anti-missile, anti-air systems that the U.S. used based in Jordan, but I do know that I read in the Times of Israel that they opened up their airspace, and the Jordanians said they were involved in intercepting hostiles in their airspace.
Yeah. Of course, the real question now, Alan, is what happens next? What is Israel going to do? Do you have any thoughts on how Israel's going to respond?
I do, and I look forward to hearing yours too. But my sense is that they won't let it go unanswered, and they shouldn't. I suspect, in April they had a very, very limited but very sharp and very accurate response against an Iranian facility attached to their military. I suspect, and then of course there were a series of targeted actions against people connected to the IRGC, including people inside safe houses in Iran, as we know, by Israel a couple months later. But I suspect they'll use air power to hit some number of targets related to the military. The real question is, will they hit the Iranian nuclear facilities, or will they just confine it to maybe the missile sites that launched this attack? I don't know, what would your thoughts be on that? I think that they have a whole smorgasbord of things they could do, and they've already proven they have the capacity to strike inside Iran by air, and they can reach out very effectively. The distance for the Israeli Air Force from Israel to Yemen, where they've hit several times, is actually longer than from Israel to Iran. So, and they of course have stealth capabilities too. But what were your thoughts on how how Israel might respond?
I would add to the list of possible targets the oil facilities.
Yes, yeah.
And
well, that's interesting.
Yeah, and
that's interesting that you say that, Larry. That's a great point. I literally just read, and I'll give the exact quote. I literally just read that the Israeli government, an Israeli government source, said just earlier this morning, the retaliation will aim to cause significant financial damage to Iran. So that speaks to your point about hitting oil facilities. That's a really good point, Larry.
Yeah, and I think the problem with the nuclear facilities, Alan, as you well know, is many of them are buried underground, and I'm not sure everybody knows where every one of them is. So they have them dispersed throughout Iran. So getting rid of all the nukes will be a real problem.
Exactly. Well said. And that's the real problem with how far down the road the Iranian nuclear program is, and that's a failure of, I would submit, U.S. policy that we allowed it to get that far down the road because, as you said, we don't know where all the assets are, largely because there's no international inspection regime at all, and B, the Iranians are because of, I think, a pretty bad set of deals made during the Obama administration. They're just now, literally from the Biden administration's own assessment, they could be weeks away from flicking a switch and having a nuclear device.
I wouldn't be surprised, Alan, if they already have it and they're just not telling anyone.
Yeah, we were discussing this morning, Alan, and we had a guy on the podcast that was a nuclear engineer, and he also thought that's very possible they're already capable of it.
Yeah, and the thing about that is they would definitely, if they have it, they would definitely, I would think, they'd want to make that known to Israel because it'd be a kind of deterrence. But if you make it known, then you invite, I think, not just Israeli, but likely U.S. and some other allied action there. But I wouldn't be surprised either, Larry. I agree with you there. They're a treacherous regime. I mean, I always say, and I know Joy's heard me say it, and I've written it several times in ASCF materials, that Iran is not a country not a government that engages in terrorism. It's a terrorist regime that happens to run a government. I mean, that's what we have to think of them as. They're not a legitimate state. They're not a normal state, and it's. I also am of the view that it's a regime that has hijacked its people. But you can't take anything that they say at their word. And so I agree with you. It's very possible that they have that, and all the more terrifying, the idea that, Israel is a tiny, small country, and one or two nuclear weapons could end the country. I mean, could erase it, so it doesn't have any strategic depth. It doesn't have anywhere to go. It can't move its government. All those things that you think about when we think of continuity of government just don't exist in Israel.
Yeah.
Well, these are all good points. So, Alan, let's get into the thrust of your article here for the survival of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading through your article, I was looking at your title, and I was wondering what was going through your head when you titled it "The Survival of Civilization," and were you thinking this world would be a different place without NATO?
Well, I do think that, and the reason I used the civilization in the line is I think in that essay I mentioned General Eisenhower. He was the first military commander of NATO, and he said that he saw NATO as the last remaining chance for the survival of Western civilization. And I think that it's so much a part, and such it's not even grafted in, it's just so much a part of what has been America's security, what has been our national security since 1949, that Americans take it for granted or don't know about it, don't even think about it. But it really, in my view, I agree with General Eisenhower. It forms kind of one of the outer tiers of our security. It's the outer zone or buffer of our security, and it has a cost. I view it kind of as an insurance policy for two sides, for us and for our European and Canadian allies. So there's cost to insurance. You obviously never want to have to use insurance, but when you do, you're happy that you paid into the premiums every month or every year, so that if something really terrible happens, you have a hedge against disaster. And I see that as NATO has been that way since '49, and I think General Mattis said it 3 years ago. If we didn't have NATO, we'd have to invent something like it. And I agree with that to this day. But I think a lot of Americans, either take it for granted, more than that, just don't know about it, don't know really what it is or what it does. Maybe that's a tribute to how effective it has been in these last 75 years.
Somewhat analogous to having your health, Alan. You don't appreciate your health until you don't. So. Well
said. That's so well said, Larry. You're exactly right. And my dad always says, when you are healthy, you have a lot of problems. When you're not healthy, you have just one problem, and it is, I'm sick. And so exactly right. I agree. It is totally analogous to health. And it's an imperfect institution. Why? Because it's run by imperfect humans, and it's populated by nation states that are full of imperfect humans, but it is effective at deterring our main enemy in that region. And I think I may mention in there, and I certainly do in part two, it's effective at helping America force multiply in other parts of the world. So NATO really doesn't confine itself to the North Atlantic area.
Yeah, I agree. And I also like your term civilization. I use that term a lot in my Western civilization in my papers also, Alan, because I think Western civilization is under assault from not only Islamic terror groups, but it's also under assault from Marxist organizations like China,
That's right.
Cuba, Venezuela, and Russia. I don't know if I'd call them Marxist, but certainly they're in the same family of autocratic, totalitarian organizations, and they're all against a Western civilization of individuality and freedom.
Exactly. That's the crux. You hit it on the head, Larry. The crux, the common ground of our enemies. They don't today, let's be very clear, they don't today have a common religious creed, a common ethno-nationalism. They don't have a common political mantra that they believe in, like the Soviet bloc did, but they have in common, they hate individual liberty. And that is the core of Western civilization, is individual liberty. As you know, we could get into a whole other podcast. One of the ironies of Western civilization and Marxism and Marxism being anti-Western civilization, is that it was from the Western civilization tradition. But anyway, which, by the way, is a tribute, I guess you could say, in a backhanded way, to Western civilization. So I agree with you. At the core of all these enemies, the Putin's Russia, Xi's China, Islamic Republic of Iran, Kim's Korea, is that they hate individual liberty. They hate the main defender of individual liberty, the United States. They hate the free world. I mean, they want to, and we saw that in 2022 openly. Putin and Xi said, we want to change the international order, which has been a liberal, freedom-oriented order since 1946. And they want to undo that. And they have proxies and partners in every corner of the world now. They're not just, we have two huge nation states first, Russia and China, and then they have these tentacles around them that are troublemakers like North Korea, Iran, Cuba, obviously Nicaragua in this hemisphere, in Cuba. It's a real, I do think I've used the phrase a Cold War II, that some people think that's overstated or overwrought, but I think it's a fair analogy. It won't be the same as Cold War I, just like World War I wasn't the same as World War II, but it kind of frames what we're in the midst of and helps us understand what we as the free world have to do to prevent a third world war. That's the key. The Cold War was expensive, costly, wasteful, but better than the alternative, which was, as Reagan said, we can have peace the next moment and all you got to do is surrender. So that was one alternative, which we didn't do, thank the Lord. The other alternative is fighting a third world war, which would destroy, again, civilization as we know it. So Cold War II, with this weird set of enemies that all agree on one thing, and you hit it on the head, Larry, they are opposed to individual liberty and the Western civilization and the free world.
Yeah.
And I think you walked in right to my next question here, is individual liberties. So you speak to the beginning of NATO and how it took America a while to join, or I guess really form this North Atlantic Treaty. And we were reluctant, and it took several acts of aggression before we did. Right. Do you think that our reluctance we felt maybe that an alliance might pull us into that collective strategy that may not reflect our own national interests?
Well, I think your question, Joy, you always ask great questions. That opens up a really fascinating kind of counterfactual or alternate history question. And Churchill was of the view, he openly said, if we had cut together, America and the British mainly, after the last war, he said this at the beginning of World War II, we wouldn't have had to have this nightmare again. I think he's right. And his idea was, if we had had some type of clear alliance, very clear and openly arrived at, that was one of Woodrow Wilson's really thoughtful points, was you can't have secret treaties. Treaties are fine, alliances are fine, but they can't be secret, because then you strike a match and you end up having the entire world on fire. But if you have clear treaties openly arrived at, and Churchill clearly believed that if we had had a transatlantic treaty in 1919 or 1920, and he wasn't the only one. There are French leaders, Clemenceau talked about a joint command of some sort with the U.S., Britain, and France after the war. The Americans wanted none of this, as we all know, and as all your listeners know. We had done our job, and we wanted to pack up and head back home, which we did. So to answer your question, I agree with Churchill that I think it's very possible that a partnership, an alliance, a mutual security, mutual defense alliance, along the lines of what ended up happening in 1949, could have staved off and prevented World War II and prevented that nightmare. Britain, we also know all of that would have required political leadership in each of those democracies, and the democracies were badly shaken, obviously psychically, by World War I. And I think what they learned after World War II was clarity about treaties, what you were for, what you're against, who you're for, who you're against, plus capability is the key to keeping some semblance of peace, certainly the key to great power peace, clarity plus capability. And that's the lesson that I think was followed throughout the Cold War, begun under Truman, Ike, and then all the way, of course, to its fulfillment under Reagan and the victory of the Cold War. And we've forgotten it. I really think, and I'd like to hear Larry's way on that, but it just seems that, sometime after the Berlin Wall fell, we figured we don't need to embrace these time-tested principles of deterrence and peace through strength and clarity.
Yes, good points.
Well, I think one of the first things you do in order to fix an illness is you have to do a proper diagnosis. And I don't think anybody's been diagnosing the threat from China and all these other Marxist philosophies that are permeating our own culture here within the United States. So you have to recognize that we're in a Cold War too, and that we have to take action in building up our strength, peace through strength, and revitalizing our domestic industry.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
I
and
totally
China's
agree with that.
not just using kinetic warfare as we see in the South China Sea, but also hybrid warfare we talk about a lot.
Yeah.
And that being
that's
said, my other question too is, as far as NATO is concerned, do you believe that NATO countries are ready to deter cyber warfare threats?
I think they are. Are they ready? I think they're a lot better postured now than they were, say, in 2007 when Estonia was blasted by a massive Russian cyber attack. That basically, paralyzed that country, which is heavily digitally connected. So I think that woke NATO nations up. They soon thereafter created a cyber defense center, and they have cyber cyber exercises, cyber defense exercises. They've incorporated the notion that they've mentioned, and this is, again, being clear with your adversary, they've signaled to Russia, and I'm sure to China, but openly, and again, open source materials that I've read, that if, we might consider, the allies, the 32 members, might consider a cyber attack or attack against infrastructure through the digital space as an Article 5 attack. And Article 5 is the all-for-one clause of the NATO treaty. It's really the heart and soul, the teeth of the treaty, that if you attack one of us in the North Atlantic area, it's an attack against all of us. And so I think that NATO's a lot better postured. I think they exercise together just like they do in the kinetic environment. They're doing that in the cyber environment. They also have devoted a lot of time, practice, and money to necessarily what they have to do, incorporating cyber operations into kinetic operations, which is what you have to do. Warfare is never just in one domain. The domains have changed and gotten more numerous in the last few decades, but the information space, NATO, I think, is a lot better better postured to deal with. That being said, China's doing a lot of cyber espionage and what I call a cyber siege, basically just pilfering billions worth of Western invention, technology. The Russians are a bit more blunt force, typical of the Russians. They use cyber to break things or to shut things down, as we saw, by the way, in the southeastern part of the United States just 3 years ago, 2021, with the attack that shut down the pipeline facilities for about 10 days' time.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there too. I didn't even really consider, but would NATO consider a major cyber attack against one of their countries in Article 5?
Yeah, they have said it. This has been fairly new the last few years. They've said it in their yearly or every other year, the heads of state, sometimes every year the heads of state meet. They made it clear we might consider that. It would be a case-by-case basis. We might consider. And by the way, that's true of other things. There have been times when territory of NATO has been impinged, or there was, I think 2017, there were Turkish airplanes that had to deal with Russian airplanes in their airspace. NATO did not, Turkey didn't invoke Article 5, but they do it on a case-by-case basis. Article 5 has only been invoked once. That was September 11. The Estonians considered Article 5. I think they ended up doing an Article 4, which is basically asking for assistance rather than full-blown, military response. But it is part of life. It is part of the free world that depends on cyberspace, and it must be defended, just like sea space, airspace, and the space beyond the atmosphere.
Mm. Yeah, and you were discussing Ukraine in your paper. Larry and I were talking about Ukraine earlier, pulling back from the Donetsk region there. Apparently, Russia's really got a foothold. I don't know how you see this going. I know we're sending money, ammunition, and a lot of other NATO countries are as well. But then there's people that are against sending money to Ukraine any further, I guess you would say. What would you say to people that are not really for sending any more money to the Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I say that, I think I tend to agree with Speaker Johnson, our U.S. Speaker of the House. I think he formulated it well, and he is in the House, at least the leader of congressional Republicans. A chunk of the Republican Party is dubious of or critical of military defensive aid to Ukraine, and he made a pretty forceful and I think logical statement. He has a son that's in the military, and he said, in his view, it's better, smarter, cheaper to send Ukraine bullets than to send American troops to defend a NATO nation after Russia were to conquer Ukraine, because Putin said that's his next thing to do. I think we should take dictators at their word a lot of times when they say Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. I think we should believe him. Ukraine is one step in that. He, in 2008, lopped off part of Georgia, which in 2014 he lopped off part of Ukraine. For many years, Russian forces have illegally occupied Moldova. The Moldovans don't want them there in a area called Transnistria. And he says that, the Baltics and part of Poland are not real countries. So I agree with Speaker Johnson on that. I think it's wiser to send bullets and bombs to a country willing to fight for itself than to send American boys in the next phase of Putin's war. And we should remember that this, we, the United States, is really good at helping countries and people who are willing to defend and fight for themselves. We're very good at that. And the difference between, say, Ukraine in 2022 and Afghanistan in 2020 or 2021, I think, is vast. And it's evidenced by how the Afghan government, which was democratically elected, I should remind everybody, fled in the face of an enemy, and how the Ukrainian government, which is democratic, responded in the face of a much more powerful enemy, by the way, in the case of Russia. So we're fighting, we're helping this country fight for itself. That's the case I'd make. I would also, especially since we're on a ASCF podcast, a great Reaganite organization, in my view, President Reagan would be leading the charge to help Ukraine fight for itself and defend itself. And as he did with his aid to anti-communist efforts in Central America, Afghanistan, and in other covert and intelligence type ways, even in Central Europe. So that's my long answer to your question. I do think reasonable people can disagree. I mentioned that there's Republicans who are opposed to Ukraine aid. There's also, it's interesting, I think it's kind of weird. You have a chunk of Republican Party that's opposed to aiding Ukraine's democracy, and you have a chunk of the Democratic Party that's opposed to aiding Israel's democracy. So that's an odd, interesting, and strange thing that's emerged, or a phenomenon that's emerged in our politics.
And as you bring up a good point, they're both Ukraine and Israel are willing to fight for themselves.
Absolutely. Neither country, Joy, as you know, but listeners need to hear, has asked for American troops, to come fight for us. Now, by the way, there are a good number of American troops in Israel. They've been there a long time. We've had basing rights and other things there, and, but Israel didn't ask for them. That's just existing relationship that we have with Israel that we just don't have with Ukraine. But those two countries aren't asking for American troops. Churchill once said, "Give us the tools, we'll do the fighting," and that's literally the message that Zelensky and Netanyahu have said.
Your thoughts on Ukraine at all?
No, that sums up mine.
Dan?
Yep, very good.
Well, thank you, Alan.
You're welcome. And one thing, just I'm literally looking. There's a great organization called the Kiel Institute, and this one thing, our listeners who are informed citizens, I know, but there's a lot of numbers that flow around. But these guys are really good at tracking Ukraine aid, and it's something that is, I don't know if it's a myth or just a misunderstanding, or sometimes maybe in some cases purposeful, but the idea the United States is doing more than the Europeans is just demonstrably not true. The Europeans, as of this hour, have allocated and sent $110 billion in total aid to Ukraine, and the American have sent $75.1 billion. That's a lot of money, don't get me wrong. And Ukraine is using it in effective ways, and I suspect some ineffective ways too. But the Europeans are stepping up. They are our allies, and they are, I think, being responsible partners in helping what's happening in their backyard, trying to reverse this Russian aggression.
Alan, could you repeat the name of that institute again and spell it?
Oh, yeah, sure, Larry. It's I'll spell it. K as in, I don't know.
K like in kilo.
K. K in kilo, exactly. I don't know the military alphabet. That's right. Thank you. K is in kilo, I, E is in evil,
Yep.
L is in Larry.
Yep.
The Kiel Institute.
Kiel.
Okay.
Kiel.
Oh, that's a German city, I think. Isn't it a German
Okay,
city?
yeah. But they have if you just run a search, Google search, Kiel Ukraine Aid Tracker, it'll come right up for your listeners.
Okay.
And I use it all the time, and it's a good job. And it also breaks down military and humanitarian aid. It breaks down the aid by country too. Obviously, as you, Larry and Joy know, individual European countries aren't giving as much as the United States, but the United States is gigantic compared to individual European countries. Whereas the EU is about equivalent to the United States in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Whether it be population or just wealth or GDP. But it's very effective, and you just scroll through there, just run a Kiel Ukraine tracker, and it'll come up for you. And it does really nice military, humanitarian, and then also by country.
Okay.
That's interesting. Thank you. Yes, and I think our listeners would like that too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and that's they're a good organization and a trusted think tank. And I think you're right, Larry. I think it's based in Germany, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I should look at that. It is. Yeah, it's based in Germany, outside Berlin. So that. But I do think, Joy, that you binding or connecting what's happening in Israel and Ukraine is thoughtful, and I think it's fair, and I think it should give us all pause that, World War II, before it was known as World War II, was basically three disparate regional crises or wars. One in Eastern Africa, one in the Asian, continent, what we call Korea today, Manchuria, China, and then one crisis right smack jab in the central part of Europe, which exploded and then all those conflagrations came together. We called it World War II, but we now have three regional crises. Two of them are hot wars. One of them is a simmering real crisis over in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
And then we have what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Israel.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's worrisome.
It is worrisome. Three hot spots to watch constantly.
Which calls for, as Larry alluded to a couple minutes ago, and I just emphasize what he said, it calls for concerted and collaborative efforts within the free world, but the United States needs to lead in turning on the arsenal of democracy, refiring the arsenal of democracy. The bad news is we've allowed it to atrophy or go cold. The good news is we have a lot more allies today than we did, and the free world is literally bigger than it used to be. And a lot of them are doing more than their share. A lot of them need to do more, but we need to do more. And there's a commission, the National Defense, I think it was called the National Defense Commission. They recommended 5% of GDP for defense for at least 10 years, and to build things up and to send a signal to these, like Larry called them, autocratic enemies, that we're not going to go down the road of 1937, 38, 39 again.
Agreed.
Yes, we do agree.
That's a lot of money, but as you guys know, I think most of our listeners know, the only thing more expensive than deterrence, deterring a war, is fighting a war. It's a lot more expensive, and in every way, mostly blood, but not just blood, also in treasure.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Alan. And yes, I in your paper you mentioned about all these NATO countries putting in more money toward the military buildup.
Yeah, and I think the next issue the readers might enjoy, not because of the writer, because of the topic, and that is it's really about what Reagan thought of NATO. And all the way up till near the time he died, he was still talking about NATO, and that's well after his presidency. And by the way, well after the Cold War was over, Reagan saw NATO as still a very important organization to American interests, and that's what the most important thing for us is America's interest. But I think that next issue will put this discussion in a very interesting light for those of us who see Reagan as a great source of wisdom and ideas.
Yes, we do here, for sure. Well, thank you very much, Alan, and we look forward to your next article.
Always great to talk with both of you, Larry and Joy.
Thank you. Same here.
And to our listeners, please subscribe, share, and comment on our YouTube and Rumble channels. You can also like and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Substack. You can listen to our audio podcasts on all your favorite Apple or Android devices. So join us again next time as we bring you the Peace Through Strength podcast.
I wanted to tell you something.